Hey everyone, welcome in. Today, we're diving into something you specifically requested, how children understand and cope with grief.
Mhm.
And we're lucky to have Corinne Masur's How Children Grieve as our
Yeah.
guide. It's great for anyone who wants to support kids through tough times.
Yeah. It's a book that really challenges a lot of our assumptions, I think.
Totally.
Because children's grief is just so different from what we experience as adults.
Exactly. Like one of the first things that struck me was like how Masur debunks the whole stages of grief thing.
Right.
Like denial, anger, bargaining, all that.
Right, that very linear progression.
Yeah.
It's simply not how it works for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And especially not for kids. I mean, they're still learning what death is, let alone processing all the complicated emotions around it.
Totally. Their whole understanding of the world is still forming. So how do children experience grief differently at different ages?
Well, Masur, she really emphasizes that a child's developmental stage is key. Like, for instance, a toddler might believe they caused a loved one's illness, like because they were upset that day or something.
Oh, wow. Yeah, because their grasp of cause and effect is still developing.
Right.
That's heartbreaking, but so important to understand.
Exactly. And as they get older, it changes again. Teenagers, for example,
Yeah.
they're already navigating all these identity questions, right?
Yeah.
Figuring out who they are.
Mm-hmm.
Losing someone who plays a big part in that identity formation, it adds this whole other layer of complexity to their grief.
Yeah.
It's not just sadness at that point, but potentially confusion about their own place in the world now.
It's like their roadmap got a little less clear just when they needed it most.
Wow. But here's a thought. What about infants?
Right.
Do they even grasp the concept of grief?
Yeah.
I mean, they don't even have the words for it.
That's something people often underestimate.
Okay.
While infants might not have the language, they are incredibly tuned in to the loss of a primary caregiver
Really?
or even a familiar babysitter.
Think about it. Their world thrives on routine, predictability, the familiar presence of those they depend on.
So even though they can't say it, that disruption to their world is deeply felt.
Absolutely. And this reminds me of that fascinating story from Bellevue Hospital that Masur talks about.
Yeah.
You see, back then they had these incredibly high infant mortality rates, but no one could figure out why.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out it was largely due to the strict separation of mothers and newborns at the time.
Wait, really? Just from being apart?
Yes.
Wow.
Once they started allowing more contact between mothers and babies, the mortality rates plummeted. It highlighted the profound impact of separation on an infant's well-being.
Yeah.
And not just physically, but emotionally, too.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how early experiences with separation, even if resolved, can have such a lasting impact.
Right.
It makes you wonder about the long-term effects of those early losses, even if a child seemed okay at the time.
That's a crucial point, and it leads us to what Masur calls maturational grief. This is the idea that grief isn't a one-time event, but rather something that can resurface at different milestones throughout a child's life.
Like they're carrying it with them, and certain events or developmental stages can bring those feelings back to the surface.
Precisely.
Okay.
A child might seem fine after a parent's death, for example, but then struggle years later when graduating from college,
Yeah.
wishing their parent could be there to share that moment.
It's almost like they're experiencing the weight of that loss anew as they hit these milestones that most people associate with family and loved ones being present.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why understanding maturational grief is so important. It highlights the need for ongoing support and understanding, recognizing that grief doesn't have a timeline or an expiration date.
It really underscores how grief becomes woven into their life story.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of different forms of grief, Masur also talks about ambiguous loss,
Right.
which I think a lot of people don't even realize is a form of grief.
Absolutely. It's less about a physical death and more about the loss of a presence, a sense of security, even if the person is still technically there.
So things like divorce, a parent being deployed,
Mm-hmm.
or even like a sibling leaving for college, those can all trigger grief responses.
Precisely.
Wow.
Masur gives this example of Kevin, this young boy who was dealing with his parents' divorce.
Okay.
And he was grieving not just the loss of his father being a daily presence, but also the loss of his family unit as he'd always known it.
Right.
His home, maybe even his routines.
It's that feeling of things will never be the same.
Right.
Even if it's not a death, it's still a huge shift for a child.
And often those around them might not even recognize it as grief.
Right.
So they don't get the support they need.
That makes a lot of sense. So with all these nuances to children's grief, what are some practical things we can do to support them?
Okay.
I know Basur talks about, tailoring our approach to their age.
She does. With infants and toddlers, consistency is key. Maintaining their routines as much as possible, offering extra physical touch and comfort, and even putting their feelings into words,
Okay.
even if they don't fully grasp the words yet.
So like saying, you seem sad today, Grandma loved you very much, even if they don't quite get the concept of sad yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about creating a safe space for them to feel their emotions without overwhelming them.
Okay.
As they get older, into those preschool and elementary years, play becomes a powerful tool.
It was how they processed the world. I
Yeah.
remember using play to cope with things I didn't understand at that age.
Exactly. Encourage them to act out their feelings, to tell stories, to use their imaginations. It allows them to work through those complex emotions in a way that feels safe and natural to them.
And at that age, they're also starting to ask a lot of questions.
Right.
How much should we tell them about death or loss?
Honesty is crucial, but always tailored to their level of understanding. Answer their questions directly, but without overwhelming them with information they're not ready for. And don't be afraid to say, I don't know, if you genuinely don't have the answer.
It's more about being present with them in their questioning than having all the right answers.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And involving them in rituals like funerals or memorial services can also be helpful at that age.
Okay.
It gives them a sense of belonging and participation in something bigger than themselves.
Right, because those rituals often provide structure and routine during a time when everything else feels chaotic.
Right.
But then we get to teenagers, and I imagine their needs are quite different.
They are. Teenagers crave independence
Yeah.
and might be more likely to withdraw or try to process their grief on their own.
Right.
It's important to respect that need for space while also making it clear that you're there for them when they're ready to talk or just need a shoulder to cry on.
So finding that balance between giving them space and staying connected.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the importance of their peers at this age. Friends become their primary support system. So encourage those connections and be open to talking about your own experiences with loss to help them feel less alone.
It's like that saying, shared joy is doubled, shared sorrow is halved. Sometimes just knowing they're not the only ones who've gone through something like this can be like incredibly comforting.
Now, with all of that said, it's important to recognize that there are times when professional help might be necessary.
Absolutely. What are some signs that a child might need a little extra support from a therapist?
Keep an eye out for prolonged withdrawal, significant changes in their eating or sleeping habits, a decline in school performance, or any expressions of hopelessness or despair.
Okay.
These can all be red flags that they might need additional help processing their grief.
Because grief can manifest in so many ways, and sometimes it's more than just feeling sad.
Exactly, and seeking professional help is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength and a commitment to giving your child the best possible support.
It's like that old saying, it takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes it takes a village to support a child through grief as well.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of support, Masur also talks about how cultural differences can play a role in how children grieve.
Oh, that's so important to consider. Like, what might look like healthy grieving in one culture could be very different in another.
Exactly. Some cultures are very open about death and grief,
Right.
while others are more private.
Mm-hmm.
Some have very specific rituals and traditions, while others might express grief more through storytelling or music.
Yeah.
It's about, understanding those cultural nuances and meeting the child where they are.
So how can we be sensitive to those differences, especially if we're interacting with a child from a background different from our own?
Open communication is key, I think.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to ask questions, to learn about their family's traditions, and to express your support in a way that feels, culturally appropriate.
So it's about showing genuine curiosity and respect for their experience, rather than, like, imposing our own assumptions about what grief should look like.
Precisely. And this kind of ties into another important point. Masur raises this concept of meaning-making in the context of grief.
So trying to find some sort of understanding or purpose in the midst of loss.
Exactly. It's this natural human response to search for meaning,
Yeah.
especially when faced with something as difficult as death.
Right.
And for children, this search for meaning can manifest in different ways.
Okay.
Some might find comfort in, remembering and honoring the person they lost, while others might channel their grief into like creative outlets or acts of service.
It's about finding a way to integrate that loss into their life story in a way that feels true to them.
You got it. And it's an ongoing process,
Yeah.
evolving as they grow and mature.
Yeah.
But it's through this process of meaning making that they can begin to heal and find a path forward.
It strikes me that while we're talking about supporting children through grief, it's also crucial for, like, the adults in their lives to take care of themselves, too.
That's such an important point. Masur actually dedicates a whole section to this in her book. It's easy for caregivers to get so caught up in supporting the child that they neglect their own well-being.
It's because you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
Right. If we're emotionally drained, we won't be much help to the children who need us.
Exactly. Self-care isn't selfish, it's essential.
Yeah.
Whether it's, carving out time for exercise or connecting with friends or seeking professional support for ourselves or even just taking 5 minutes to breathe deeply and recenter.
Yeah.
It's crucial to prioritize our own well-being so we can show up as our best selves for the children in our lives.
It's about replenishing our own emotional reserves so we can continue to be that source of strength and stability for them.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something we touched upon earlier, traumatic bereavement.
Right.
This is such a complex and difficult experience, and I think it deserves a little more attention.
I agree. It's not just about the death itself, but the circumstances surrounding it, the violence, the suddenness, the unexpectedness.
Yeah.
These things can make the grieving process even more challenging for a child.
So what are some things to keep in mind when supporting a child who's experienced this type of loss?
Masur emphasizes the importance of immediate and ongoing reassurance.
Okay.
These children need to feel safe, both physically and emotionally, creating a stable and predictable environment, establishing routines, offering consistent care,
Okay.
and letting them know in very concrete ways that they are loved and protected is essential.
So beyond just saying, like, I'm here for you,
Yeah.
it's about taking concrete actions to demonstrate that support and security.
Exactly, and in these cases, professional help is often crucial.
Right.
A therapist experienced in trauma can provide the specialized support these children need to process the event, to address any feelings of guilt or responsibility they might be carrying,
Right.
and to, develop healthy coping mechanisms.
And it's not just about the child, right?
Right.
Their caregivers need support, too.
Absolutely. Traumatic bereavement impacts the entire family system.
Yeah.
Parents and caregivers, they might benefit from therapy as well, both to process their own grief and to gain tools for supporting their child's healing journey. It can be incredibly helpful to have that guidance from a professional who understands the complexities of trauma.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. It's given me a whole new perspective on how to approach conversations about loss and grief with the children in my life.
Yeah.
What are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with today?
I think the most important thing is to remember that children are incredibly resilient, but they need our understanding, our empathy, and our unwavering support to navigate the complex landscape of grief.
And by acknowledging their pain, validating their feelings, and providing a safe space for them to grieve in their own way on their own timeline, we can empower them not just to cope with loss, but to grow and thrive in the face of it.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it as insightful as we did. Until next time, take care of yourselves and those you love.